This paper is called Mapping Spatial Violence, Dispossession, Public Housing, and New Communities. I gave this paper for the 13th Annual Symposium of the Society of Architectural Historians, Latrobe chapter, whose theme this year is Race, Ethnicity, and Architecture in the Nation's Capital. I gave the paper on February 23rd, 2021. It draws on work that I've been doing over the past 8 years for mapping segregation in Washington, D.C., of which I am the co-director, and on work I did to support a successful historic landmark designation in January of 2019 for Berry Farm Dwellings, a public housing complex that over the past 2 years has been entirely demolished except for the few buildings for which we were able to gain landmark status. In 2004, former DC Mayor Anthony Williams launched the New Communities Initiative, an ambitious program that would privatize public housing and subsume it within larger developments designed primarily to serve people of greater means. By eliminating existing public housing communities and requiring those who would qualify for it to live among higher earners, New Communities promises to enhance what it calls, quote, human capital. In so doing, it relies on a decades-old narrative that blames residents, rather than systemic disinvestment, for having caused the physical decline of public housing. Although public housing has been a very important site of community organizing and cultural production, it is most commonly framed as a site of crime, violence, and domestic dysfunction. Geographer Rachel Brahinsky has written that, quote, property is a story, and that the stories that we attach to property can make certain outcomes seem inevitable. Indeed, the New Communities Initiative relies on certain stories about public housing. One, that it is a failure, and two, that the, quote, concentration of poverty, that is the presence of too many poor households in one place, is to blame for that failure. The elimination of public housing is facilitated by the discursive devaluation of the long-standing communities that already exist at these sites, who often rely on one another for childcare, rides, picking up groceries, and other basic necessities, and may have deep relationships as neighbors that have helped care for each other for many years. In other words, there's little regard for the value that these communities already have, and how such communities are especially valuable to people who are economically marginalized. Also ignored are the contributions of these communities to the fabric of the city overall, as if they have had no positive role in shaping DC as we know it today. The discourse of new communities posits that these existing communities are best served by being broken up and dispersed throughout the city, essentially erasing them from the city's landscape altogether. This is how a former public housing site is described by a self-identified citizen journalist who in 2008 received an award for her work on the redevelopment of DC's Navy Yard neighborhood in Southeast DC. This building and several others have since been replaced with a massive new development called Capitol Quarter, covering 23 acres. The project was initiated with funds provided by the federal government's Hope 6 program, the predecessor of DC's New Communities. In reality, as sociologist Edward Getz and others have discussed, the conversion of public housing to privately operated so-called mixed income developments primarily serves as a tool for real estate investment and capital accumulation by municipalities looking to, quote, revitalize or gentrify areas that have long been occupied by the poor. Framing the elimination of public housing as a solution to crime and poverty, though in reality it has had the opposite effect, has served to justify the removal of longstanding Black communities from areas deemed too economically valuable for them to occupy. As shown by the dramatic transformation of the Navy Yard area's racial demographics over the past 2 decades, so-called revitalization has replaced a community that was more than 90% Black with one that was around 70% white by 2018. Less than half of the approximately 1,000 units of public housing were replaced with units that those same tenants could afford, and these units comprised only about half of the new housing that was built. New luxury condos and apartments, combined with the opening of Nationals Park in 2008 and amenities aimed to attract high-income residents to the neighborhood, have made the entire area more expensive. In the end, the redevelopment of this area has significantly increased the need for heavily subsidized housing while providing far less of it than existed before. If property is a story, then so is the politics of land use. And I'm going to tell this story as one that is rooted in dispossession, displacement, and persistent segregation via the upheaval, dispersal, and erasure of communities that stood in the way of development. In telling this story, I will contextualize the so-called revitalization of Berry Farm, one of 4 sites targeted by new communities, within a history of racialized housing policies that have repeatedly uprooted longstanding Black communities in the DC area. Berry Farm's it's located on the east side of the Anacostia River, just across the river from the Navy Yard. So on these maps on my screen, it's Berry Farm is located in the area that I'm pointing to now. Chapter 1, the Nacotchtank. For thousands of years, before the U.S. Capitol's establishment at the confluence of 2 rivers, this area was home to the Nacotchtank. The tribe's name was Latinized to Nacostans or Anacostans, for which the river would be named. Their most dense site of settlement was along its east bank, near the same area that would later become Berry Farm. Although the so-called Nacostans occupied this area for thousands of years, they were almost entirely erased from the area's landscape over the course of just 3 decades, between 1662, when their land was transferred to a private owner, and the late 1690s, when the last of them were pushed to a settlement in Pennsylvania. Although seemingly quickly forgotten, evidence of the Nacostans could be found all over the city 2 centuries later, as an anthropologist for the Smithsonian wrote in 1890. He wrote that, quote, "So numerous indeed are the remains in certain localities that they are brought in with every load of gravel from creek beds, and the laborer who sits by the wayside breaking boulders for our streets each year passes them by the thousands beneath his hammer. And it is literally true that this city is paved with the art remains of a race who occupied its site." Notably, one of the most significant discoveries of Nacotchtank remains in 1936 occurred close to where Berry Farm dwellings would be built in the early 1940s. A construction crew digging runways for what would become Bolling Air Force Base unearthed the bones of at least 126 people from 2 burial mounds. But the site had already been so destabilized that it was almost impossible to learn anything from these remains about the former village at this location. Chapter 2. 100 years after the establishment of the District of Columbia in 1791, Black Americans lived and owned land in areas that would soon succumb to a new wave of settler colonialism, as real estate developers partnered with city leaders, white citizens, and the federal government to force Black residents off their land, clearing space for new white housing, parks, and schools. As DC's Black population grew during the early decades of the 20th century, the city became increasingly segregated. New white housing, white playgrounds, and white schools, and the corresponding demolition of Black housing and Black schools shaped the city's landscape. The location on the outskirts of the city of schools serving Black children provide evidence of these communities' former existence and how established they were. In 1912, 40 families were displaced from Meridian Hill for the development of a Grand Renaissance style park, now known as Meridian Hill Park or Malcolm X Park, to serve the growing number of whites only subdivisions north of the city's former boundary at Florida Avenue. Almost all of them moved in the same direction, toward areas that were becoming increasingly crowded with Black residents. Land would later be taken from homeowners here, again in the Berry Farm area to build berry farm dwellings. Racially restrictive deed covenants, used widely by developers of new subdivisions during the first half of the 20th century, explicitly associated race with the value of property, thereby inflating the value of areas that were exclusively white and devaluing areas of mixed or primarily Black occupancy. They served to displace longstanding Black communities that had owned land west of Rock Creek Park and in the city's northernmost ward, as these areas were developed as white enclaves. And you can see some of the remnants of these communities on this map where I'm pointing that there was a community around the Chain Bridge Road area, around the Reno area. This community was displaced for the construction of a white school and park in the 1920s and 30s. There was a small Black community in the Brightwood area in Fort Stevens, and up here in Tacoma. Closer to the city center, covenants formed barriers around where Black people lived, as you can see again on this map. This map, made by the Federal Housing Administration, used race to assign value to sections of DC and its suburbs. Areas where the vast majority of Black residents lived were assigned the lowest grades. The H-graded area just across the river, the Potomac River from DC, was home to the communities of Queen City and East Arlington, outgrowths of a former freedmen's village established by the federal government during the Civil War. The F-graded area of Berry Farm was also established by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867, but in this case, land was actually sold to Black Washingtonians and incoming migrants. Their descendants still lived there in the early 1940s when their land was taken, not long after the creation of this map, for the development of a public housing project on the site. In 1941, the community in East Arlington and Queen City was also evicted with less than a month's notice for the construction of roads to serve the Pentagon. DC's Alley Dwelling Authority, the predecessor to the city's Public Housing Authority, was established in the 1930s. The ADA operated under the theory that conditions such as poverty and criminality, in reality the outcome of systemic racism and over-policing, could be addressed by eliminating slum housing and forcing people to move. So that these areas could be reserved for new development downtown, instead of building new housing, the ADA mostly replaced alley communities with parking lots or garages, or in some cases, with new public housing for white residents. In 1943, the ADA became the National Capital Housing Authority, which was supposed to provide new housing to people evicted from alleys downtown. But people were often pushed out of their old homes long before the new developments were available, and there was never enough new housing to accommodate them, especially if they had large families. For the relatively few projects built to house low-income Black residents, strict application criteria left many displaced residents without anywhere to live. Chapter 3. The community of Berry Farm, known as Hillsdale by the generations of residents who built up the area and lived there until the mid-20th century, consisted of 375 acres dedicated for Black land ownership in the wake of the Civil War. Its remote location was chosen after the government met resistance to Black residents west of the Anacostia, and Freedmen's Bureau officials still had to negotiate in secret to buy the land, which was hilly, densely forested, and filled with underbrush. By 1869, more than 260 Black families owned property here, where there was space for grazing livestock and cultivating fruit trees and gardens. Some of the largest properties hugged the Anacostia River's shoreline. There were 2,700 families here by 1895. The Berry Farm community was home to the sons of Frederick Douglass, who, along with their father, served in city government before the fear of Black leadership led Congress to strip D.C. of its right to a self-elected government for an entire century, beginning in 1874. In 1941, D.C.'s nascent housing authority used eminent domain to force landowners from their homes for the construction of Berry Farm dwellings, a segregated public housing complex. It prioritized applications from Black Washingtonians displaced for wartime construction projects, including a new military highway that split the larger Berry Farm Hillsdale community in half. The 91 families who lost their homes for this highway, later called Suitland Parkway, visible here, were given just 20 days' notice to vacate. The parkway became part of a network of major roads that wrapped around Berry Farm dwellings and cut off access to the river. Land was also taken from another much older Black community nearby, whose patriarch, Tobias Henson, had originally purchased property in the early 19th century after buying his and his family's freedom from slavery. Home to at least 80 people, this community was replaced with another public housing project, the Frederick Douglass dwellings. Despite the severe housing shortage for Black Washingtonians, whose population grew 30% in the 1940s, the Housing Authority reported in 1943 that at first they had a hard time finding tenants for Douglas dwellings because even people who had nowhere else to live, quote, dreaded moving far away from familiar neighborhoods to the outlying sections of the city. However, because there was more open land east of the Anacostia and less resistance to Black settlement in remote areas far from downtown, most public housing would continue to be built in these isolated neighborhoods across the river. Chapter 4. At Berry Farm, 442 units of public housing were built in an area where just 23 households had formerly occupied all of the land. While drastically remaking the landscape and transforming the community that occupied it, the increasing density was somewhat offset by the project's design. It retained the historic layout of widely spaced parallel streets and intentionally lacked cross streets, which saved on paving and utility costs and also helped maintain the safety and privacy of residents by reducing through traffic. In keeping with public housing design principles, common green spaces, including shared yards and walking paths, were meant to cultivate community. The Housing Authority also made what it called, quote, an unusual provision for families with children by building units with 3 to 4 bedrooms. Some of these units would eventually be combined with smaller ones to create 6-bedroom houses in which multi-generational families could live. The design of the site and the individual buildings were also intended to maximize natural light and cross breezes, and super blocks of organized but varied layouts provided a sense of unity to the whole site. The parallel streets sloped upward from the Anacostia River, allowing for views of the Washington Monument and the Capitol across the river, and creating a sense of openness. Berry Farm dwellings had the feeling of being within the federal city on one hand, but has also been described by former residents as a haven from the city. This ability for Berry Farm residents to see downtown from a site that was not visible if you were looking from the other direction mirrors the community's simultaneous engagement with the rest of the city and relative invisibility to those who governed from or lived on the other side of the river. Generations of people who lived in Berry Farm were responsible for the most significant civil rights achievements in the city's history. In the 1950s and 60s, they desegregated the schools and led a national movement for economic justice. Anti-discrimination laws introduced by Lewis Douglas in the 1870s became the basis for a Supreme Court decision almost a century later, requiring DC restaurants, theaters, and hotels to serve Black patrons. Families who lived here in the 1950s organized to desegregate the city's schools, becoming plaintiffs in DC's companion to Brown v. Board of Education. In the 1960s, Berry Farm would play a central role in citywide tenant organizing and in the national welfare rights movement, influencing the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s economic platform. Chapter 5. After the city announced in 2006 that Berry Farm would be converted to a new community, tenants spent more than a decade fighting their pending eviction. They gradually dispersed throughout the city and beyond. Many moved to other public housing sites that are also slated for demolition. Skeptical of the promise that they would return to the site after it is redeveloped, there will be fewer units at rents they can afford or that are large enough for families. Displaced tenants and advocates initiated a successful effort to preserve some of Berry Farm as a historic landmark. The landmark buildings will ensure that even if most tenants never return to the site, at least some evidence of them and their predecessors will remain. The buildings provide an opportunity for the site's history to be honored and serve as a formal assertion that the communities who lived here had value. As gentrification advances eastward, 14 other public housing sites are currently slated to be privatized and potentially demolished. And in the capital of a nation where property ownership is inextricably linked to citizenship, public housing tenants and other Black residents are continuing to fight for their right to stay in DC. Thank you.